Turning on the sound.
What is today's date?
18.
It's on.
Tell me when.
When? Go.
This is George Groom. Here we are on September 18 for another question and answer session from Groom Guitars. As usual, I'd like to remind folks that my personal email address is george@guitars.com. I'm readily available, and I do answer those messages if you email me. I'm also easy to reach at the shop phone number, 615-256-2033. I'm in 6 days a week, and I get emails on my phone, so even if they come in on Sunday when we're closed, I still read them, and I still tend to respond promptly. So I'm always interested in hearing from people with whatever questions or comments they may have to offer. Today is a sort of semi-special day in guitar history, at least so far as celebrities. And for that, I'm going to bring on my repair shop foreman, Greg Voros, who has a comment on that.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning here. September the 18th, 2020. Behind me, I have two beautiful instruments, one being a Gibson, if you guys can see it here, Flying V. Then you have a Stratocaster, and they're significant because they're both were reissued by these manufacturing companies for the late Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix passed away 50 years ago today, September the 18th, and that definitely should be made mention of, given that Jimi Hendrix was a pioneer in our world, especially with regards to vintage guitars and rock and roll and what he's done. So I would like to say that in light of the social and political climate nowadays, I think everyone could benefit from listening to some Jimi Hendrix, maybe some Bold as Love, Axis Bold as Love, one of my favorite albums. And it would be perfect to put that album on, especially at around these times. It's hard to imagine that Jimi Hendrix passed away 50 years ago, but that's what we have. The Flying V is incredibly important. It's a reissue of a late 60s V that Gibson made. The Strat is very much like the one that he set on fire at the Monterey Pop Festival. And that's what's going to be hanging behind George here. So just wanted to point that out. And I wish everyone enjoyed today and listened to some Hendrix. All my love.
We have plenty of comments from our listeners, so I can just plow right in and we'll go through reader questions. Steve says, I keep hearing certain phrases around Martin guitars. Can you explain these, please? What are bar frets? Bar frets, unlike modern frets, which have a curved top and a small tang that goes into the fingerboard, are uniform thickness from the top right on down into the fingerboard. And I'll show you an example. Hold this close enough. You can see that these frets go into the fingerboard equal thickness as above the board. So modern frets have a small tang that goes into the board. as seen here. You can see the part that goes into the fingerboard is smaller than the curved part that sticks up. The modern style fret with the tang that goes into the board actually existed as early as by 1830. But Martin continued to use the old style bar frets through late 1934. The bar frets gave Martin at that time the ability to use compression fretting. They had bar frets of slightly different thicknesses, and they could straighten out a slight warp in the neck, and it would stiffen the neck, so they did not put a metal reinforcement in. But Martin decided in the 1930s, specifically by the end of 34, that with increasing use of steel strings, of heavier gauges, that they needed more reinforcement. So they put in a metal steel T-bar in the neck in late 34. And at that same time, they went to the modern style frets. So at any rate, that's the answer to that question. His next question, what exactly is herringbone? Sounds like fish bones, but don't understand how that ends up as appealing finish work. Well, it's not a finish work, it's wood marquetry, edge trim, which Martin used on style 28 guitars, starting in the mid-1800s and continues to this day on many models. And I'll show you an example of that. Here, the herringbone edge trim, which you can see right there. This is wood marquetry, and this is on the back. And on the center of the back, they have a zigzag back stripe. And that is also typical of the style 28. These are patterns that Martin used by the mid-1800s and still are used today on many models. The herringbone trim ended in very early 1947, but then was reissued starting on the HD28 in 1976 and is used today on many models. And then Steve asks one further question. Pre-war is obviously before World War II, but what precisely is different and noticeably better about these instruments? With all we know today, can't they be made equally well? The fact is, pre-war also depends on where you were. If you were in Europe, 1939, that war was certainly on. And in the USA, we view our entry to the war starting with Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941. But the fact is that Martin had been changing specs over the years, and we can discuss that more. But pre-World War II, labor was cheap, especially during the Depression. And there was more handwork. Also, there was more handwork because there was less precision equipment to mechanize. Today, we have CNC equipment, computer numeric control. They didn't have that pre-World War II. So there were some things that had to be done by hand that today can be done in a mechanized manner. Some things CNC machines can do extraordinarily well. Some things handwork does better. But the fact is there was more handwork in the old guitars. For one thing, hand labor was cheaper. There were a lot of skilled handcrafts people in those days, more so than today. And the technology today is such that we can do things by machine, computer controlled, that could not have been done in the past. And in some cases, such as cutting a dovetail joint, if you can do things to within 1,000th of an inch accuracy or fret spacing, there are some things a machine can do with more precision than can be done by hand, and other things where human judgment makes a difference. But also the quality of wood available, air seasoned, naturally aged, and species that are not readily available today or not even legal today were readily available pre-World War II. Today, we can't get newly cut Brazilian rosewood, and there are numerous other endangered species that are not legal and not ecologically sound to use. But the fact is, human knowledge today is still very good. We haven't forgotten everything from the past. There's still good wood available, and individual craftsmen today can be every bit as skilled, and in many cases more so, than the people working at the factories in the 1920s and 30s. And the same can be said of electric guitars. People aren't stupider today than they were in the past. They may or not be more intelligent, but we do have accumulated knowledge. And knowledge can be passed from one generation to the next by photos, by videos, by conversation of younger people with older people, by writing. And also, we have instruments that with proper care can last hundreds of years. We can see the instruments themselves and study them. There is no reason why it is not technically possible to make guitars today every bit as good as in the past, and we have more accumulated knowledge. There are also some things that we know from experience or design flaws of even the best instruments of the past. For example, most makers would install a pick guard made out of nitrocellulose, glued direct to the top, and that had the potential for problems. Nitrocellulose tends to shrink over time. It wasn't really known that it would do that when that plastic was new. But 40 years later, oops, it shrinks a bit. And if you use a glue that is very firmly adhering to the top, something's got to give. If it has a pick guard glued on before the guitar is even lacquered, and then lacquered over, firmly glued in place, and the guard shrinks a bit, it can pull on the top and cause the top to crack. And most makers today realize this, and they do not glue a pick guard with that same type glue now. They typically will use a glue that has some give to it, such that it's not going to cause the top to crack. And there are various design flaws over the years that we can discover, that if we build something new, we might do it differently. Today, almost everybody puts an adjustable rod in the neck. We also have some materials that work very well that were not available in the past, such as carbon fiber that was not used pre-World War II, but you can do reinforcement of that. And you can do bracing that has reinforcement, and some makers are using that quite effectively. So there's some materials that were not available in the past that we do have today. And there are other materials such as Brazilian rosewood that were readily available in the past that we really can't use today on new instruments. But at any rate, that gives you some view there. It is possible to make good guitars today, but also I would say that Martin, during the Depression, was making far fewer guitars per year. So if you're making 5,000 guitars a year, you know, you can get good wood easier than if you're trying to make 100,000. You can do air seasoning. But if you are making 100,000, maybe you want to use kiln dried wood to get enough of it, or else you're going to be storing wood for a heck of a long time and have a lot of it. But it's just like if you go to the Jack Daniel's distillery, what takes the most space is not actually the distillation area, but it's all those sheds with whiskey that's sitting there aging. Takes more space for that, because if they age it 7 to 10 years, depending on which particular version it is, you got 10 years worth of it sitting there. If you want to increase production, then you have to plan that 10 years in advance. Going onward, William Clark. I have a question about a 1963 Gibson SG Les Paul that I purchased from your store a couple of years ago. The guitar is currently set up with a Gibson AVR1 bridge with no wire retainer. I believe it is nickel plated. In the case, it was a second bridge. This one is Mark Gibson and has a patent number 2740313. It has a wire retainer. I was wondering which would be the correct bridge. Well, the bridge with the wire to help hold the saddles in place came in by 62, and Gibson was still using up some of the old ones, but in 62, it's possible for it to be original either way. He also has a question about the truss rod cover. It has a metal engraved truss rod cover with the name Larry Wilson on it. And he says the correct one would be a black plastic with Les Paul on it. Well, the fact is either one can be correct. There was a metal truss rod cover option offered if a owner wanted to have his name engraved on it. And so it could very well have been ordered from the dealer with the customer's name, or very likely it came with the plastic one that said Les Paul engraved on it, but later the customer decided through the dealer to order one with his own name. So it could have left the factory with that truss rod cover, or it could have been installed later, because he could have ordered it through his dealer at the time he bought the guitar and switched covers. But either way, it is a Gibson truss rod cover, and in my opinion, it would not significantly change the value of the guitar. It's sort of a neat conversation piece to have that on it. In fact, if I had one, would I take it off? No, but if you don't want somebody else's name on the guitar, you may want to go look for an original. But the fact is, finding original parts can be very expensive these days. People will pay sometimes hundreds of dollars even for just a switch tip. For if your Sunburst Les Paul doesn't have the original switch tip, there are replicas that look very, very, very close. It would take only an extreme expert to tell the difference between some of the best replicas. But again, the metal cover is a Gibson component and would not damage the value of the guitar. Karsten Haslett sent in a question about Gibson Alnico 5 pickups with the rectangular pole bars that are height adjustable. They're in the same basic type cover as goes on a single coil P90 pickup, but the pole magnets actually are, rather than just pole screws, it actually has pole magnets that are height adjustable. And those pickups appeared on the Les Paul Custom from the very beginning. The Custom appeared in the 54 catalog, but there are a few that actually have 53 serial numbers that left in late 53, and those have the Alnico 5 pickup in the neck position. those same pickups were also used on a very few ES-175s and on Gibson L5 CES, Super 400 CES, and on Birdlands. Those pickups were used on those models through mid-1957, at which time they switched to the patent applied for humbucking pickups. But the Alnico 5 is a very good pickup. Sounds fairly similar to a P90, but not identical. And on the guitars, such as the ES-175, which typically had, before 1957, most of them had P90s, but very few had the Alnico 5. But the Super 400 CES and the L5 CES, those prior to the Alnico 5s had P90 pickups. So the L5 CES came out around 51 and had the P90s originally. At any rate, the Alnico 5 pickup is a good pickup and was also used on a reissue of the Les Paul Custom. There was a reissue model made that had the specs of the original Les Paul Custom, and those are early 1970s, and they're quite a good guitar. It was an excellent model. It was one of Gibson's better reissues. It looked very, very close to the original. So that's a rather desirable item, actually, these days. We have a question from John Parsons. It says, I've seen the Beard solid body electric guitars on Gruhn's website. What can you tell me about them? Are they highly recommended? Paul Beard is best known as a maker of resonator guitars, but he himself is a fine electric guitar player, and he is now tooled up to make acoustic guitars and electric guitars. And his electric guitars are of good quality. The craftsmanship, I think, compares very well to Gibson or Fender so far as the quality of craftsmanship. His guitars would sound probably closer to a Gibson. He's not doing bolt-on neck guitars like a Fender, so he's not doing anything that resembles a Strat or a Tele. He is also making electric guitars to my specs. I chose him to do that model for me because I feel that he is one of the very best available. He's also somebody who's not only tooled up to do it, but was willing to do it. So there's plenty of makers these days who make fine quality electric and acoustic guitars, but not every one of them wants to be a subcontractor for me. So when I designed an electric guitar, which I have been doing that since the mid-1980s when I was affiliated with Guild, I designed a bunch of different models for them. But I've gone on to design electric guitars since then, and we are getting ready to soon make a bit of a splash as far as making a marketing campaign to market the new Gruhn model electrics, and those are made by Beard. So I certainly recommend Beard as being a very fine builder. And I will grab one of the Gruhn models. It'll take me about 5 seconds. I'll be right back with one of them that you can see that was made by Paul Beard. And here it be. This is a new Gruen model electric guitar made by Paul Beard. It has the Gruen name on it. And it is a very high quality instrument. We offer them with curly maple tops or spruce top. And this is Seymour Duncan Seth Lover pickups. And we also offer them with TV Jones Filtertrons. And if somebody wants a different option, we can do it with any kind of pickup they want. This is mahogany neck and back. And it is a fine quality guitar. But the point is, Beard is one of many makers these days producing good quality instruments. There's far more good quality luthiers today, as far as factories and independent workshops and independent one-man shops, hand building instruments, more of them today than probably ever before in the history of the instrument. So it is possible to get good instruments made today. Chal Pivik, do you have any thoughts to share about modified utility acoustic guitars like those done by Scott Baxendale? And Scott Baxendale and his son also are doing quite a few guitars where they'll take old Harmony or Kay or Regal instruments that were relatively inexpensive student models and rework them, adding X bracing, adding a truss rod in the neck, rebuilding them so that you get an instrument that was made anywhere from the 1930s on up into the 60s that has been reworked to be a better instrument than it started out to be. They can be quite good. It depends in part on just how good a guitar they started with. And of course, it obviously also has to do with the skill of whoever is doing this type conversion, since Scott's not the only one doing that. My own personal feeling is, if you're good enough to do that, then you were also good enough to just build a guitar from scratch. And the amount of labor involved in doing this is very considerable. If you're going to add a truss rod, then you're going to probably end up removing the fingerboard and having to route the neck and install a rod, reassemble it. And to brace the top, you're going to have to either take the top off or the back off to get at it and do all that. And you'll end up doing binding work and finish work. You're also usually ending up with a product that may not actually be as good as if you built the whole guitar from scratch, because often enough, those necks on those student model guitars that they're modifying may be poplar or wood that's really not as good as mahogany or maple. And the quality of the wood on the top and back and sides, again, and the fingerboard is just, you can go out and buy better wood. And if you're good enough to make the guitar, my own feeling is you might as well just, it's about as much labor to convert one of those things and take it apart and put it back together and do all that work. You could have just made a guitar. And I'd rather have a new guitar. For example, you can buy a new Martin DSS 17, map price $1,559. It's a really good guitar. Sounds good, plays well, looks pretty good. Or you can get a new Beard, or you can get a Waterloo by Collings, and you can buy a good quality new guitar for about the same price that you would buy a reworked cheap student model guitar that has not the best of craftsmanship when it was new, and certainly not the best materials. So I myself am skeptical about the real merit of doing this. And the fact is, Scott Baxendale has built many guitars from scratch that are quite good. And the people who are doing this know how to do it. So they should just, so far as I'm concerned, my recommendation is, if you want something of that nature, buy a new one. Dennis Banks asked, are you familiar with the Hawaiian luthier Bob Gleason? The one-word answer to that is, prior to this morning, the answer was no. As of this morning, I did go online and looked, and it is quite evident that he does good work, but I haven't seen one. I haven't played one. Nobody's brought one in and shown it to me. But today there are hundreds of luthiers building guitars, and many of them are good. And almost every week I'm finding out about somebody who does good quality work that I've never seen before. It used to be that I could say with a high degree of confidence that just about all the really skilled luthiers out there, other than the major factories like Martin, Fender, Gibson, Guild, you can pretty well count on the fingers of one hand. But that's not true anymore. Today, the Guild of American Luthiers has at least 3,500 members. The Association of Stringed Instrument Artisans has a considerable number. Not all of them are equally skilled, but I'd have to say that there are hundreds of makers today in the USA making good quality guitars. And there's also quite a few smaller shops and factories, workshops. For example, I would call what Paul Beard has a workshop rather than a factory, because he has 8 employees. But it's still not just Paul personally building everything all by himself, and he has CNC equipment. They do excellent handwork. They also do excellent machine work. And but the guitars that Paul Beard is doing for me, he cuts the pearl right there in his own facility using a CNC. Tops are carved. The instruments are very skillfully made. And he's not alone. CNC equipment also used to be extremely expensive, and now there are smaller units that even individual one-man shops can have. So there are hundreds of builders out there doing good work today. In that sense, this is a golden era. Do they make better instruments than the finest ones of the 1920s and 30s? That we can debate. But is human ingenuity less than it was in the past? The answer is no, it's not. There are people today who are highly skilled and are making good instruments. But I personally am still very fond of the old ones. But if I thought that there was no way to make good new ones, I wouldn't be buying so many custom Martins. I wouldn't be featuring them so prominently in my shop. There are some very good instruments made by a wide variety of makers. There are also many instruments made by excellent makers that I'm not carrying at my shop. That doesn't mean I think they're not good. It means they may not be profitable for me to handle, or these same makers may not sell to dealers. They may sell direct, and they may have a waiting list of years. If a maker has a waiting list of 8 years for a guitar, he doesn't need a middleman. They don't sell through dealers, they sell direct. But the fact that I don't carry them new does not mean that I don't think they're good. There are plenty of makers doing fine quality instruments that Gruen Guitars doesn't handle, but we still acknowledge that they're very fine instruments. So we have what works for us. But there have never been more good instrument makers in the past than there are today. There are more makers today than ever before. Dennis Banks asks, my thoughts on the Martin D45 GE model compared to limited series Martin D45 Brazilian rosewood guitars. Well, Martin has made many versions of the D45 in the past years. The original D45s, first one was made in 1933 for Gene Autry. It's a 12-fret slot head. The second one was made for Jackie Kid Moore in Milwaukee, and that was in 1934. It was a 12-fret with a solid peg head. And after that, through 1942, there were a total of 91 made. But then it was reissued in 1968. And in 68 and 69, they were made with Brazilian rosewood back and sides, standard. And then from 1970 onward, they typically feature Indian rosewood, although there have been limited editions with Brazilian rosewood since then. The Martin GE Golden Era was a model made with Adirondack spruce, forward shifted scallop bracing, ivoroid bindings, Brazilian rosewood backsides and peghead veneer. And originally, we sold quite a few of those. They had a retail list price that was right on about $20,000, but dealers discounted them. But then later, when Brazilian rosewood was no longer available, as of June 11, 1992, Brazilian rosewood was added to the CITES Treaty Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Chris Martin made the decision that since it was no longer readily available and he had difficulty finding any that had proper CITES certificates, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species required a certificate for any wood to demonstrate that it was cut prior to June 11, 1992. He decided to raise the price on that model to $50,000, whereupon demand for it went down to virtually zero. And in fact, the number I ordered after that was zero. But those are very good guitars, and they compare very favorably to the limited edition reissues in Brazilian rosewood made after that. So these days, one of those, the D45 GE, will sell for more money now used than I used to get for them new. But they are very much comparable to other limited edition reissues with Brazilian rosewood, although there have been several that were not exactly reissues, but were more fancy, like the D45 LE, and a number of others that were D45 variants, but had more ornamentation than a pre-war D45, so they're not comparable. But at any rate, the GE was a very fine guitar, but they're no longer making GE series guitars. So they are now making a variety of other models, which are very fine quality. Martin quality today is far better now on most of their models than it was even 50 years ago. Alexander Zares says, can you discuss the change from forward to rear shifted X bracing in Golden Era Martins? Did the bracing change in any other way when it shifted, like the thickness or depth? Did the spruce top thickness change? Well, in late 1938, Martin changed from their so-called forward shifted bracing, where the X brace on the top crossed very close to the edge of the sound hole, to the rear shifted, where it was moved almost a couple of inches back further. And Martin's reason for doing this, at least nominally, was to make the top stronger and less prone to buckling up when people were using heavy strings or tuning higher than standard. But the top thickness didn't change at that time. The bracing thickness stayed about the same, but there was much more change after the first quarter of 39, Not only did Martin stay with the rear shifted bracing, they changed the nut width from 1 3/4 inches to 1 11/16. They changed the neck dimensions where it became less of a taper. The previous necks got quite thick in depth by the 12th fret, and much more so at the 12th than they were at the first, whereas there was less taper from after the first quarter 39, and the string spacing at the bridge also went a bit narrower by almost 1/4 inch. So from after the first quarter 39, the guitars were significantly different. They were still very good, but they were different. And the ones that are the most sought by many bluegrassers, at least, are the pre-late 38 with the wider neck and the forward shifted bracing. Those do bring the most money today. But the fact is there are some great sounding ones after that. It's a matter of personal preference. Plus they do feel quite different. The neck dimensions are markedly different. George Van Wyn, London, UK, so England. I've been hearing for some time about the legendary The Tree. Have you had any instruments made from Tree pass through your store? And if so, what is your opinion of them? Is this tree really unique? The Tree is a mahogany log that was found, that was already on the ground and was in a deep jungle area that had just been there for nobody knows how many years. But it is one of the most highly figured pieces of mahogany that had ever been found. Virgin forest, dense wood, aged well over 100 years, beautiful wood, and great sounding. So far as sound, I think it's really very similar to the Sinker mahogany guitars that we're selling. They're custom ordered from my shop that are made by Martin. Virgin forest, old wood, grew in a dim light in a dense forest. So it tends to be a bit heavier per cubic volume than stuff that is secondary growth that got more light and could grow faster. And the wood from The Tree is gorgeously figured, and people are paying a lot of money for it. Beautiful figure helps sell guitars because they're pretty. Does it make them sound notably better than wood that has less fancy figuring? I think the one-word answer to that is no. For example, pre-World War II, for Martin's highest grade guitars, especially from the 1920s and earlier, what they always were looking for is straight grain quarter cut. And they were not looking for fancy swirly grained wood, which is also more often slab cut. And Martin felt that the structurally and sonically best wood was straight grain. But in general, beautifully figured wood will bring more money. And Sinker mahogany, some logs are beautiful and some are very straight grained. But so far as sound, is there an instantaneous difference that is recognizable? Not especially, but at least I'll show you an example of a nice pretty piece, especially beautifully figured piece of Sinker. Here is an example of gorgeously figured Sinker mahogany. That to me is as pretty as any piece of rosewood. It's pretty spectacular stuff. And this is on a Gruen 50th anniversary Dreadnought. And 50 Gruen models have been made for the 50th anniversary of Gruen guitars, which is this year. And they are available in D, 14 fret quadruple O, and 12 fret quadruple O with fancy pearl trim, Ivoroid bindings, and beautifully figured, carefully selected wood. But I have to say that gorgeous figure does not automatically guarantee better sound. The finest Stradivari and Guarneri violins do not necessarily have spectacularly figured maple. For Sunburst Les Pauls, people will pay huge money more for beautifully figured maple. Doesn't make any difference at all in the sound of the guitar, but some people will pay $500,000 plus, sometimes more than that, for gorgeously figured wood on a Sunburst Les Paul from 1959 or early 1960. On a Stradivari or Guarneri violin, people don't pay any extra at all for curly wood. You can get a student model violin made in China with beautifully figured wood for a couple $100. Or you can buy a genuine Strad or Guarneri with far less figured wood for $10 million. But guitar players like pretty wood, and they will pay extra for it. Pretty wood and sonically perfect wood are not always the same. But I can say that the tree is sonically very, very fine wood, and it is beautiful too. And it tends to be used only on very expensive guitars because the folks selling that wood are charging a bleeping fortune for it. So it is used only by makers producing high-end guitars. If you're going to ask, is it worth it for the price, for sound alone? My answer is probably not. But you're buying a piece of art, and you're going to probably be buying it from a very, very good maker because rank amateurs don't buy that wood. So it's that's an exceptional tree, but does it mean that it is the finest sounding wood ever? Well, again, rosewood and mahogany have different sound. Sinker mahogany is great stuff. I think it sounds as good as rosewood, but it also matters, what is it paired with? If it's paired with Sitka spruce rather than Adirondack or European alpine or Carpathian, I think you wasted the wood. To get the best results with fine quality mahogany, I think it needs to be paired with very fine quality spruce. And in my opinion, Sitka spruce is not the best match for that wood. And it's been asked again by several people in this round of questions, what's my opinion of torrefied tops? And I'll say it again, I prefer naturally aged wood. The torrefied tops are physically more brittle. They are less prone to changes in humidity, so they're stable in that regard. Their harmonic structure, as far as the sound, is not the same. I have a strong preference for the naturally aged rather than the torrefied. And all custom guitars that I offer that are made to my specs have non-torrefied Adirondack spruce tops. And so I have a clear preference. Some people might call it a prejudice. I'll call it a preference. Ultimately, players can try the guitars and listen and hear for themselves what works best for them. But when it comes down to quality of tone, I'm listening for volume that's balanced string to string and note for note all over. Dynamic range on every note. Can you play it soft, medium, and loud and without distortion? I want to hear harmonic response, the quality of the complexity of the tone. I want to hear clarity of articulation. And if it has those basic features, balance of volume, balance of sustain, balance of tonal complexity, dynamic range, and clarity of articulation, it's going to be a good instrument. And you can get good sound out of a variety of woods. But to me, Adirondack spruce or alpine spruce or Carpathian, those spruces are exceptional. And Sinker mahogany and Brazilian rosewood are very exceptional, but you can build a great sounding guitar out of some other rosewoods, including Indian rosewood, which is a readily available wood. But Indian rosewood paired with the right top wood is a very fine sonic wood. It's every bit as good sounding, if not more so, than Madagascar rosewood, which looks very much like Brazilian, but doesn't sound the same and is not as hard. And certainly like Brazilian rosewood can make an excellent bridge and an excellent fingerboard, but the Madagascar rosewood when used for a fingerboard turns out not to be structurally as strong, and necks are more inclined to warp. So that matters. And that also will answer another question from Peter, who asked about my opinion on Sinker mahogany versus rosewood and Adirondack versus Sitka and other wood. I have a question from Jeffrey. What do I think of the Cremona brand classical guitars? And I am familiar with those. Cremona, K-R-E-M-O-N-A. They're made in Bulgaria. The company's been in business since 1924. And in Bulgaria, they use Cyrillic alphabet like they do in Russia. So I've seen photos of their factory where the name Cremona is written in the Cyrillic alphabet. At any rate, their guitars are primarily what would be viewed today as good student quality, but they're actually quite good. I've seen Mike Noble on the Opry staff band has several Cremona brand guitars, including a flamenco and a classical. And I've played those and seen them and actually had a couple here at the shop, and they're pretty darn good for the money. Do they beat the finest handmade luthier-built instruments? Well, I would say no, but are they respectable, good quality guitars? I would say yes, they are. Bang for buck, they're just fine. And there are other Eastern European makers. There's quite a few makers in the Czech Republic and also some in Romania that can do pretty good work. And also in violins, there's some quite good instruments, bang for buck, made in Romania that are good. But there's a tradition that goes back a long way. As I said, the Cremona factory in Bulgaria has been there since 1924. So there are good instruments made there. George gave a question. I'm considering buying a 1966 Gibson Firebird 5 non-reverse model. It sounds great. What can you tell me about the Firebird guitar in general or its history? I'm not really familiar with the model, even though I've heard of it. Well, again, I can't go into a book-length description of that, but Firebird Gibsons were introduced in 1963. The originals had a neck-through body construction where the neck and middle section of the body were the same piece. There was laminations in them. And then there were two wings glued on the side of the body, but the neck and middle section of the body were the same. So you couldn't replace the neck because it was an integral part of the body. And the early ones had banjo-type tuners, and then they were shaped somewhat reverse of a Fender. So they called them reverse body, and the peg head as well was almost a mirror image, but not quite exact Fender shape, but vaguely like it. So they called them the reverse body. And then in mid-1965, they switched to the so-called non-reverse body. That's Ted McCarty had left Gibson. Stan Rendell came in as a new president. He cut a lot of corners. They cheapened the product considerably. The reverse body ones were made very different from the so-called non-reverse models. The non-reverse has a glued-in neck, and instead of having individual routing for the pickups, they just cut a big trough and get a Firebird 1 that had 2 single coil pickups in the non-reverse, or the 3 that had 3 single coil P90 pickups, or the 5, Roman numeral 5, that had 2 mini humbuckers, special Firebird design though, with no poles, no adjustable poles. And they had a Firebird 7, Roman numeral 7, that had 3 of the special Firebird metal covered pickups. The original reverse bodies, the Firebird 1 had 1 pickup, and the 3 had 2 pickups. The 5 had 2 pickups, but more ornamentation, had bound fingerboard rows with Brazilian rows of fingerboard with trapezoid inlays, and the 7 had ebony board with block inlays and binding and 3 gold-plated pickups. But when they came out with the non-reverse models, they all had the same body and the same neck, all dot inlays, no binding. And the non-reverse models, in my opinion, don't sound as good as the so-called reverse models. They have some collector's item appeal. If the sound appeals to you, great. But is it equivalent to the previous non-reverse model? The one-word answer is no. And is it equivalent in price? The answer also is no, but it's still a good guitar. It would have sound quality basically equivalent to the same year SG with the same type pickups. William says there's no question that regular hard playing on a solid top, arch top, or flat top guitar opens up the wood and generally improves the instrument's tone and projection. My question is whether the same can be said for pressed guitar tops, such as early Stromberg arch tops and many other guitars. The answer to that is yes, it still does have an effect on that. Even a pressed or even laminated top will still improve in sound with more playing, but it will be less dramatic than on a really well-made guitar with a solid carved top, or on a flat top guitar with good quality solid wood. But still, yes, the answer is absolutely, it does make a difference to play the guitar and to break it in some pretty hard playing, and even a little bit of wake up time each time you play it. Grant asks, I was wondering if you could talk about the D18 and its history with being a go-to guitar for bluegrass players. I know a lot of bluegrass players gravitate toward this model. I recently acquired a 1964 D18. It's an amazing instrument to me. However, it seems to open up a lot after a lot of playing, and then it closes up again like a Venus flytrap. I've noticed a big difference in tone when I go from my favorite blue chip pick to a prime tone pick as well. The blue tone chip is my favorite. It's warm and mellow. Prime tone is completely different. The guitar sounds much brighter with this pick. I find it interesting, and certain guitars sound good to one's ears, but it isn't until you hear them recorded or from across the room you realize why they sound so good and certain tonal space. Well, the D18 is a very popular model, not only with bluegrass people, but also numerous others. Bluegrass backup players in general think of the D28 as their go-to guitar, and many lead players think of the D18 as their go-to guitar, and a lot of studio players also think of the D18 or mahogany guitars in general. Mahogany back and sides as being the go-to. It's a different sound with rosewood versus mahogany, or for that matter, if you have a maple back or a different type of wood walnut. Each type of wood has its own tonality. The D18 is not the bluegrass guitar for backup players, but it's certainly a very good one. The D28 rosewood guitars are more the bluegrass backup guitar. But again, Clarence White played more with the D18 than he did with his D28. He had the D28 that Tony Rice later got, but Tony also had quite a bit of work done to make it physically more playable. Clarence used it for a bit of rhythm, but his primary go-to guitar was a 1950s D18. A D18 can be a very fine guitar. But again, if your guitar seems to close up like the so-called Venus flytrap, well, there's a lot of guitars that you need to give a little bit of warm up. And sometimes it may take just 5 minutes of pounding on it each time you pick it up to open it up, and then it's ready to go. In general, if your guitar sounds good after some warm up, and then you don't play it again for a month, you may have to warm it up a bit, but that's okay. Spend 5 minutes and just hit it hard, play loud for just a few minutes, and then you can back off and play soft and pretty after your guitar wakes up. That's true not just of D18s, that's true of acoustic guitars in general. Playing hard does make a difference. Even if you don't like to play hard and you play everything very soft and pretty, you can still have a better sound playing soft and pretty after you warm it up. It's sort of like an athlete doing some warm-up exercises. You don't have to play loud all the time, but it is playing hard that will wake up a guitar. Cameron asked, spoken about many fine guitars built by accomplished luthiers that, while good, are not equal to pre-World War II Martins, for instance. I'm interested, however, in how collectors might go about pricing the extremely wide variety within a model offered by current luthiers. I know predictions are impossible. There seems to be so many custom options with guitars today, wildly different wood combinations, custom built specs, custom inlays. Guitars of yesteryear adhered more or less to standard, but while evolving through the years, could at least be applied to most guitars produced in that series. Today, there might be a guitar from Collings, Bourgeois, Froggy Bottom, Santa Cruz. It is technically the same model, but can retail for $5,000, $7,500, $10,000, $15,000, or even $20,000 plus, depending on the specs. How do you think collectors will go about pricing such a wide variance even within a single model series? Well, the answer is it's tough to tell. And do I have an ironclad rule for what to tell you on that, or what they're going to be worth in the future? No, I don't. But obviously, Brazilian rosewood will bring more money, and today they have some wood that is even almost fossil. It's dug up out of peat bogs, and some out of New Zealand, where they found some wood that's been buried for thousands of years, and they're building some guitars, and they're charging a lot of money for it. What will be the investment potential for some of that in the future? I don't know, but there's certainly luthiers charging a lot of money for some of these instruments and getting it. There are makers charging as much as $100,000 plus for some new guitars. John Monteleone has made some guitars for over $250,000. Will they be easy to resell in the future? Well, I'm not personally investing in those, but does he make great guitars? He does make a very, very fine guitar, but a lot of those are things that will be displayed rather than played. Displayed and played are not the same thing. Some of these things will be great conversation pieces. They may be highly collectible, but to be highly collectible, there should be more than one person that wants them. A lot of these things are highly valued by the person who ordered it, but like custom tailored clothing may not have great resale value to somebody else. I personally don't invest in that stuff, but that's not to say that these makers aren't good, because some of these makers are very highly skilled. But all the makers that you named, Collins, Bourgeois, Froggy Bottom, Santa Cruz, they build some very fine guitars. Am I handling a whole lot of Bourgeois, Froggy Bottom, or Santa Cruz new? The answer is no. Does that mean that I don't think they're good? The answer to that is also no. They're making very good guitars. And I am more limited in the number of brands that I wish to represent. And that's, again, what works for me in my shop, in my business model. But just like I don't handle new Monteleone guitars. He doesn't wholesale guitars. He only builds maybe 10 guitars a year. They're beautiful. They're also extremely expensive. And he has no trouble finding customers for them. In fact, I don't think anybody today is making more money on a guitar so far as new than he is. But there's hundreds of makers out there, and many of them are quite good. But so far as predictions for the future, a lot of times people ask me, how much is my guitar going to be worth in 10 years or 20 years? I had one guy ask me, how much is Les Paul be worth in 50 years? And my answer has always been, I don't have a crystal ball to give me an answer to that. And I said that so many times that finally I was out at the flea market. I found the answer. It's right here. There it is. So anytime now that I want to find out, I can tell you first, what does the crystal ball tell you? Well, first, see if you do this. Golly, if you look real close to the crystal ball, it'll tell you a whole lot about something that's right there now. See, it magnifies. But if you look from a distance, see what you see? The world's upside down. And today, my golly, our world seems to be topsy-turvy and upside down, such that it's really hard to make predictions. Whereas Yogi Berra said, the trouble with predictions is it's hard to do because they're about the future. So Steve asks, he says, I have a 1961 Fender Stratocaster. I'm curious about what contribution the original bridge saddles are understood to have on the sound of the instrument. Unfortunately, mine are missing. Well, fortunately, there's a whole lot of reproduction bridge saddles now, but even if you can't find the originals, you can get new ones from All Parts and others that are very, very close in specs to the originals, or you can even get new ones that are different, made out of titanium if you want a brighter sound. But some of those Zymac alloy saddles really are piss poor. And if you have some like that on one of your 1970s Fenders, you might want to change them because they are interchangeable and you can get better sounding ones. But the sound, the bridge saddles do make a difference in sound, but the 60s and 50s saddles have been reproduced with excellent replicas. So if yours is missing the originals, from a utilitarian point of view, you don't have to go out and buy genuine 1950s or 60s saddles. You can get that sound out of new ones. Carl Chilton asks, why are the 1944 Gibson J45 and SJ Banner models so valuable? Well, the Banner logo models were made from 1942 through 1945, and they are not better than pre-World War II Gibson guitars, and they are not more valuable than pre-World War II Gibson guitars. They're good, and they bring more money than the ones from the later 40s or 50s or 60s. But are they the ultimate Gibson guitars ever made? My answer to that is no. Are they better than a pre-World War II Advanced Jumbo? Absolutely not. In my opinion, the best sounding Gibson Dreadnought the company ever made in the entire history of Gibson Company was the 1930s Gibson Advanced Jumbo. But so far as mahogany Dreadnought-sized guitars, I would certainly much rather myself have a 1934 or 35 Jumbo or a 1936 through 42 Gibson J35. I'd rather have one of them than have a banner logo Gibson. But the banner logos are still good guitars. Mike Donahue asked, is the Martin HD28 simply a D28 with herringbone binding? And the answer to that is, when it came out in 1976, the answer was no, because in addition to having herringbone trim rather than the black and white lines of the standard 1970s model, the HD28 had scalloped bracing, whereas the standard D28 did not. Warren Stanley. Everyone talks about Gibson, Martin, Fender guitars and the elite makers of the 1930s to the late 50s or modern guitars, but there's also appeal about the cheaper, trashy guitars of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, USA and Japan from mass makers to provide the first guitar for many players who went on to better things and better brands. I'd love to talk about those guitars one day, thanks. And I have been concentrating primarily on guitars that may well be relatively expensive and from premier makers. But the fact is, people didn't always start out with one of those. They did start out with student models. And there are some Japanese guitars that were actually pretty darn good. And there also were American guitars, such as Danelectro, that was active in the 50s into the 60s, that made some guitars that were surprisingly good for blues. And some of the best blues players ever didn't have any money. Those Delta blues players, especially the black players, were impoverished. They didn't have great guitars, but they did make some great music. And Mance Lipscomb played on a harmony guitar, but he produced amazing music. And one doesn't necessarily have to have a snob appeal guitar to make good music. And some of the best music in the world was composed by people who didn't have really great guitars, but they were great players. In the hands of a great player, even a mediocre guitar can make great music. And a lot of blues music was composed on guitars that were kind of funky, and they managed to find interesting tones that if you try to play the same thing on a Martin or a Gibson, sometimes it sounds too smooth and doesn't sound bluesy. So there are good sounds to be had, sometimes in pretty funky instruments. But in the hands of a great player, even a mediocre guitar can be good, and a superlatively fine guitar in the hands of somebody who has no talent still doesn't produce good music. So there's a lot of options out there, and many people's memory of their first guitar is very sentimental. And if it weren't for those first guitars, they might never have gone on to make music at all. And they might never have gone on to even ever own any of those great ones later. Those student models are important. And student models today, while they may not have a lot of snob appeal, are better than almost any time ever in the history of guitar making, because with CNC machines, even a cheap student model guitar can have a truss rod that actually works, have intonation that is accurate, and have comfortable neck dimensions. And the electric guitars can have decent electronics and great playability. There's nothing wrong with starting out on a student model guitar. Entry level is important, because if you don't have entry level, then you'll never have anything much better to follow. And with that, I'm going to sign off. Look forward to hearing from people for next week. Till then, have a good one.